On a quiet winter evening in St. Mary Mead, a courteous stranger arrives for supper and vanishes without a trace. Beneath polite smiles and warm lamplight, old grudges stir and forgotten sins awaken. As whispers spread, Miss Marple listens, knowing silence often hides the deepest truths. Chapter 1. The village of St. Alderley looked as though it had been arranged by a careful hand, and then left to breathe on its own. A thin winter sun lay on the thatched roofs, and on the damp hedgerows that held the lanes in gentle curves. Smoke rose from chimneys in slow ribbons. Somewhere a kettle sang. Somewhere a church bell tested a single note, and then fell silent again. As if remembering that it was not yet time, Miss Jane Marple sat by the front window of her cottage, with a small basket of wool in her lap. Her needles moved with steady patience. The stitches grew quietly, like a secret. The window glass carried faint ripples, and beyond it the lane shone with a recent rain. She watched the world with the same mild expression with which she watched her knitting, as if both were equally capable of surprising her. It was not only the lane she watched. It was the way the butcher's boy paused to speak to the postman. It was the way the postman leaned in a fraction, lowering his voice, though there was no one near enough to hear. It was the way, a moment later, the butcher's boy walked on more quickly, as if he had remembered an errand and did not wish to be questioned about it. One might have called it nothing at all. Miss Marple did not call it nothing. She had long since learned that nothing at all was often the name people gave to the beginnings of trouble. A soft knock came at her door, brisk and familiar. Before she had set her needles down, the door opened, and her niece, Raymond's wife, had entered with the breezy confidence of family. Dolly Bantry had always walked as if she were crossing a drawing room, and had misplaced the rest of the house. "Aunt Jane, you are in, thank goodness." Dolly brushed rain from her gloves. "You always are, of course. I do not know why I speak as if you might be swinging from chandeliers." Miss Marple smiled. "Not today, dear. It is rather damp for chandeliers. Would you like some tea?" "I should like it very much." Dolly sat, then leaned forward, eyes bright with the pleasure of bringing news. "There is to be a small gathering at Gossington Hall. Not one of those great affairs where everyone pretends to have eaten something and no one has. Something comfortable. A supper, and afterward perhaps a little music, if the piano behaves itself." "Gossington," Miss Marple repeated gently. She knew the house, large and respectable, with lawns that looked effortless and rooms that carried the warm smell of polished wood. She also knew what it meant when a village prepared for a gathering. It meant the village prepared stories. "Yes." Dolly lowered her voice, though there was no need. "There is a guest coming. A man. And everyone is quite absurd about it." "Absurd in what way?" Dolly hesitated, searching for the proper description. "They are being careful. You know what I mean. They are being careful in the way they are careful when they feel something might be important. But they do not quite know what. Mrs. Price Ridley says he is a friend of the family. Mr. Clements says he is connected to some business Mr. Bantry once had in London. Reverend Granger says he is a gentleman who has been unwell and needs country air." "That is a number of different things for one man to be," Miss Marple said. Her voice was mild, but her eyes were attentive. "And yet everyone speaks as if they have met him, or ought to have met him." Dolly frowned. "It is as though he is familiar without being known. Do you see?" Miss Marple did see. She had seen it before in other villages, in other parlors, in other lives. There was a certain kind of stranger who arrived with a story already written for him, and the village eagerly supplied the chapters. "Perhaps he resembles someone," Miss Marple suggested. "People can be very certain about a face that reminds them of another face, even if they cannot place it." Dolly laughed. "Oh, Aunt Jane, you make it sound so sensible. But there is more. Mrs. Price Ridley says the guest will be dining with the family only, quite quietly. Then she says, in the next breath, that he will be introduced properly, because it would be rude not to. So it is quiet, and it is formal. It is both. And everyone is waiting. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose. The kettle had already been warming. She poured tea with the care of a ritual. The steam rose like a small comfort in the chilly room. "What is the gentleman's name?" she asked. "That is another thing." Dolly took the cup. "Some call him Mr. Ambrose. Some call him Mr. Armitage. Mrs. Price Ridley swears it begins with A, though she cannot recall which A. Mrs. Hawes at the shop says she heard it was Mr. Andrew something. And then Mrs. Bartlett said she thought she heard Mrs. Bantry say the name was not important, because he preferred privacy." Miss Marple's smile remained. "Privacy is an interesting preference in a village." Dolly nodded vigorously. "Exactly, and it is making everyone itch with curiosity. Arthur says we are all like cats at a mouse hole." Miss Marple sipped her tea. She did not hurry her thoughts. Hurrying often frightened away the truth. "When is the supper?" "Tonight." Dolly reached across and touched her aunt's hand. "And you are coming. I have already told them you are." They were pleased, though they pretended it was only natural. "Aunt Jane, you will come, will you not?" Miss Marple did not pretend she was reluctant. A gathering, a guest, a village that could not settle on a name. The ingredients were simple, but the outcome might not be. "I will come," she said. Dolly exhaled in satisfaction. "Good, because I want you to see him with your own eyes. I want you to tell me whether he is the sort of man one forgets or the sort of man one remembers. I cannot decide which." Miss Marple looked out at the lane again. The butcher's boy had gone. The postman had gone. The wet shine on the ground remained, reflecting the pale sky. "There is another sort," she said softly. "The sort of man one thinks one remembers, which can be the most troublesome of all." Dolly blinked. "That sounds rather ominous." "It is only observation," Miss Marple replied. "Human nature does not change very much. People often prefer a familiar mystery to an unfamiliar truth. They spoke of small matters then, as people do to keep the world ordinary." Dolly complained about a draughty window at Gossington. Miss Marple offered a practical suggestion. Dolly laughed and promised she would forget it, and then remember it later. The tea cooled. The light shifted. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had wrapped herself in a warm coat and hat, and allowed Dolly to escort her by car along the lanes. Winter lay close to the ground in the damp air. The trees were bare, their branches like careful ink strokes against the sky. Gossington Hall appeared at the end of its drive, dignified and calm, its windows glowing warmly, as if the house were already telling its guests that they would be safe inside. In the entrance hall, voices rose and fell with pleasant restraint. Footsteps moved on polished floors. The scent of beeswax and flowers floated together. A maid took Miss Marple's coat. Dolly moved ahead, greeting people with ease. Miss Marple followed at her own pace, letting the scene arrange itself in her mind. There were the familiar faces, each with their familiar expressions. Colonel Havisham with his stiff cheerfulness. Mrs. Price Ridley with her eager civility. Reverend Granger with his gentle seriousness. Two young women from a neighboring village, fluttering like pale birds. And in the center of it all, like the quiet point toward which everything leaned, a man stood near the fireplace. He was neither tall nor short, neither handsome nor plain in any striking way. That itself was notable. His hair was dark, brushed neatly. His suit was well cut but not showy. His hands were clean and steady, resting lightly on the back of a chair as if he had borrowed it for the moment and would return it without leaving a mark. He turned as Dolly approached and gave her a smile that was polite, appropriately warm, and measured to the exact degree. It was the smile of a man who understood social expectations. "Mrs. Bantry," he said. His voice was pleasant. Not too deep, not too light. Miss Marple noticed, as she always noticed, how the room responded. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned in slightly. Colonel Havisham straightened. One of the young women looked quickly at her companion, and then away. Dolly introduced Miss Marple. "This is my aunt, Miss Marple." For a fraction of a moment, the man's gaze held Miss Marple's face with the quiet intensity of someone reading a label. Then he bowed slightly. "Miss Marple," he said, as if he had heard the name before, and wished to honor it without revealing too much. "It is a pleasure to meet you," Miss Marple replied. "The pleasure is mine." He held the statement with a calm certainty. "I am grateful for such kind hospitality. The countryside is very soothing." Miss Marple studied him with gentle interest, the way one might study a new flower in a familiar garden. She noted the careful neutrality of his clothing, the clean line of his collar, the fact that his shoes were polished but not new. A man who wished to pass unnoticed would not polish his shoes. A man who wished to be respected would. And then she noticed one more thing. When he spoke of the countryside, his eyes did not drift to the windows, or to the view beyond them, as most people's eyes did when they spoke of such things. His eyes stayed on the people. That was not unusual, she told herself. It was simply informative. A bell rang softly, announcing supper. The room arranged itself into movement. People paired and flowed toward the dining room as if rehearsed. Miss Marple walked with Dolly, and as they passed the guest, she heard him speak again, quietly, to Mrs. Price Ridley. "I appreciate your discretion," he said. "It is a comfort." Mrs. Price Ridley murmured something that sounded like reassurance. Miss Marple's ears were not sharp in the sense of eavesdropping, but sharp in the sense of understanding. Discretion. Comfort. Words chosen not for meaning alone, but for effect. At the table, Miss Marple found herself seated at a reasonable distance from the guest, near enough to observe without appearing to. That, she knew, was often the best seat at any gathering. The soup was served. Conversation began. It was the kind of conversation people used to cover their curiosity, like a tablecloth spread neatly over a stain. The guest spoke when spoken to. He laughed gently at small jokes. He asked polite questions that encouraged others to talk about themselves. Miss Marple noticed that he asked questions that were safe. He did not ask where someone had been last year. He asked how they enjoyed the village now. He did not ask about family histories. He asked about the weather. He did not ask about old quarrels. He praised the beauty of the hedgerows. And yet, for all his politeness, there was a feeling in the air that was not entirely comfortable. Miss Marple could not have defined it to someone who demanded definitions. It was like the pause after a clock ticks, when one expects the next tick and does not hear it at once. Dolly leaned toward her. "Well?" she whispered. Miss Marple kept her voice equally low. "He is very careful." Dolly's eyes widened. "Careful in what way?" "In the way he wishes to be understood." Miss Marple looked down at her spoon, and then back up. "He is arranging himself for the room." Dolly frowned. "Oh, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple smiled. "We all do it to some degree, dear. The question is why." At the head of the table, the host lifted his glass for a small toast. There was warmth, good humor, and the sense of a village enjoying its own civility. The guest lifted his glass as well. The light from the chandelier caught the rim and glinted. For a moment, as he raised the glass, his cuff slipped back slightly. Miss Marple saw the edge of a mark on his wrist, quickly hidden again. It might have been nothing. A faint scar, a line from an old injury. It was visible for a heartbeat only. Miss Marple's attention sharpened, not because a mark was suspicious, but because the world had offered her a detail, and she did not wish to waste it. The supper continued. Course followed course. The guest's presence became woven into the evening like thread. And still, beneath the warmth, that faint sense of something withheld remained. When they rose from the table and returned to the drawing room, the air felt softer, more relaxed. The fire burned low and steady. Cups of coffee appeared. Someone opened the piano. A young woman played a piece that sounded like falling water. Miss Marple sat in a chair near the side, her hands folded neatly. She watched the guest as he stood by the mantel, listening as if he enjoyed the music. But his gaze was again on the room, not on the pianist. He was watching, listening, measuring. A village could be deceived by many things, Miss Marple thought. It could be deceived by charm. It could be deceived by confidence. It could be deceived by its own desire for an interesting story. And most of all, it could be deceived by the simple habit of assuming that a person who behaves correctly must also be truthful. Outside, the winter evening deepened. Rain began again, lightly at first, tapping the window like patient fingers. Miss Marple felt, very calmly, that the night had not yet finished arranging itself. The music ended, and the room responded with polite applause that was more affectionate than enthusiastic. People smiled at the pianist, with the kindness of those who understood how difficult it was to offer beauty on demand. A few guests drifted closer to the fire. Others moved toward the side table where coffee and biscuits had appeared. Conversation loosened like ribbon untied. Miss Marple remained where she was, her eyes moving quietly from face to face. She had always found that the most revealing moments in a gathering came after the main event. During supper, people performed. After supper, they relaxed. Their words became less deliberate, and their silences became more honest. Dolly returned with a cup of coffee and offered one to her aunt. "He is charming," she said in a low voice, as if admitting something she had tried not to believe. "He is," Miss Marple agreed. "Charm can be a real gift. It can also be a tool." Dolly glanced at the guest. He was now speaking with Colonel Havisham. The Colonel's laugh was a little too loud, the laugh of a man determined to show that he was perfectly at ease. The guest's smile remained steady. "I cannot make him out," Dolly confessed. "He seems like someone I should know." Miss Marple sipped her coffee. "That feeling is not always reliable. Sometimes it comes from the smallest resemblance. A similar turn of the head, a voice that rests on certain syllables. People often build certainty out of crumbs." As she spoke, Miss Marple watched the guest's hands. He held his cup without gripping it. He set it down without clinking the saucer. His movements were smooth, but not soft. There was a strength kept carefully under control. The drawing room had the comfortable disorder of a house in use. Books lay on tables. A vase of late winter flowers stood near the window. A small clock ticked steadily. And yet, for all its warmth, Miss Marple felt the room had become a stage, not because anyone was behaving theatrically, but because everyone was aware of watching and being watched. Mrs. Price Ridley approached Miss Marple with a smile that attempted casualness and achieved only effort. "Miss Marple, how delightful you could come. We are always so pleased when you grace us with your company." "It is kind of you to say so," Miss Marple replied, and meant it. Mrs. Price Ridley glanced toward the guest. "Is he not most agreeable?" "He seems very polite," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Price Ridley's smile tightened slightly. "Polite, yes, and such a gentleman." "One can always tell." Miss Marple's eyes remained soft. "One can often tell what someone wishes to be." Mrs. Price Ridley laughed uncertainly, and then remembered she was supposed to be laughing. "Oh, Miss Marple, you always have the most amusing way of putting things." She moved on, leaving behind a faint trail of perfume and unease. Dolly leaned closer. "Aunt Jane, do you think she is frightened of him?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that she is frightened of what he represents." "What does he represent?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She watched as the guest excused himself from Colonel Havisham with a small nod and began walking toward the doorway. He did not look left or right as he walked. He moved with purpose, as if following an invisible line. A maid passed him carrying a tray. He paused to let her pass, with courtesy that cost him nothing. Then he continued. "He represents," Miss Marple said softly, a question the village has not finished avoiding. Dolly followed his movement with her eyes. "He is going out." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. The rain had thickened. It could be heard more clearly now, a steady pattern against the windows. Outside, the garden lay in shadow and wet. The lawns would be dark and shining. The paths would be slick. It was not a night for wandering. And yet the guest had gone. Dolly frowned, then tried to appear unconcerned. Perhaps he is only stretching his legs. Men do such things. They cannot sit still. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though she did not believe it. A few minutes passed. Conversation rose and fell. Someone told a story about a misdelivered parcel. Laughter scattered politely. The fire crackled. The clock ticked on, steady and unconcerned. Miss Marple noticed the hostess, Mrs. Bantry's friend, glanced toward the hallway twice. The second time, she spoke to a maid in a low voice. The maid nodded and disappeared. Dolly set her cup down. "They have noticed." Miss Marple's gaze remained calm. "Yes." The maid returned and spoke quietly to the hostess. The hostess's face, trained in social composure, did not change dramatically. But a small tightness appeared at the corners of her mouth, the kind that came when a person tried to hold a door shut against worry. She moved across the room and addressed the guests with a gentle smile. "Mr. Ambrose has stepped out for a moment. He will be back shortly. Please do make yourselves comfortable." Mr. Ambrose, Miss Marple thought. So that was the name they were using tonight. She wondered what it had been yesterday, and what it might become tomorrow. The room continued to behave as if nothing had happened. People nodded and returned to their conversations, grateful for the permission not to be alarmed. But their eyes began to drift toward the windows and the hallway. Curiosity sharpened. Something in the air tightened again. Miss Marple sat quietly and listened. It was Reverend Granger who spoke first, in that soft voice that made even idle remarks sound like gentle sermons. "Rainy night," he said to no one in particular. "One must take care on the paths." Mrs. Hawes, the shopkeeper's wife, responded with the eagerness of one who liked to contribute. "Oh, indeed. It is very easy to slip near the yew hedge. I have always said they should lay more gravel." Colonel Havisham chuckled. "The man will come back soaked to the skin, and we shall have to pretend it is not a nuisance." Someone else laughed, but the laughter fell flat. Dolly leaned toward Miss Marple again, voice barely above a breath. Why would he go out in this rain? Miss Marple answered with the truth she had learned through long years of watching people. Because he wished to be alone. Or because he wished to meet someone, Dolly whispered. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Dolly's face. Her niece's imagination was lively, but not foolish. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "that is also possible." The hostess excused herself, still smiling. This time she did not attempt to hide her concern. She moved toward the hallway and disappeared. A slow 10 minutes passed. Then another. The guests began to shift. Cups were set down. Conversations faltered. The piano lid was closed softly. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had leaned in. Dolly rose. "I am going to see what is happening." Miss Marple stood as well, moving with the unhurried steadiness of someone who refused to be rushed by panic. "I will come with you." They entered the hallway. The warm glow of lamps made the polished wood gleam. The house felt large and quiet, the way houses did when something had gone wrong. From somewhere, Miss Marple heard a door open and close. They found the hostess near the back entrance, speaking to the butler. The butler's face was grave. A maid stood nearby with a shawl, as if prepared to wrap someone who might return wet and shivering. "Mrs. Bantry," Dolly began. The hostess turned, relief and worry mixing in her eyes. "Dolly, Miss Marple." Her voice remained low. "He is not in the house. We have checked the rooms and the library and the small sitting room. He is not there." "The garden?" Miss Marple asked. The hostess nodded. The butler has sent a man to look. The paths are slippery, and it is quite dark. Miss Marple's mind remained calm. Calmness was not the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let fear become the only voice in the room. Was he wearing a coat? Miss Marple asked. The hostess hesitated. No, not that I saw. He left the drawing room quite quietly. I assumed he was stepping into the hall for a moment. Miss Marple looked at the maid holding the shawl. Is that shawl his? No, miss, the maid said. It is mine. Mrs. Bantry thought it might be needed. Miss Marple nodded. A small detail, not a conclusion. But details were the bricks from which conclusions were built. Footsteps approached. The man sent to look in the garden returned, wet and breathing a little harder. Ma'am, he said to the hostess, he is not out there. Not on the paths. Not by the hedge. The rain has washed the stones. But there are no fresh prints beyond what we already made searching. The hostess pressed her hand to her chest, as if physically holding herself together. Then where is he? The butler cleared his throat. Shall I call the constable, ma'am? The hostess looked at Miss Marple as though Miss Marple might supply the missing piece simply by being present. Miss Marple did not offer drama. She offered questions. May I see where he left? Miss Marple asked. The hostess nodded quickly. Yes, yes, this way. They moved toward the drawing room. Miss Marple walked slowly, letting her eyes take in the hallway. A small rug lay near the doorway. A coat stand stood in the corner. On it hung several coats, neatly arranged. Miss Marple's gaze touched them briefly. In the drawing room, the guests had risen now, gathering in small, uncertain clusters. The warmth of the earlier evening had thinned. The room felt like a place waiting for instructions. The hostess addressed them with controlled calm. Our guest has stepped out and has not yet returned. Please do not worry. We are simply making certain he is quite safe. The guests murmured. Some nodded. Some looked startled. Some looked, Miss Marple noticed, almost satisfied, as if the evening had finally become as interesting as they had hoped. Miss Marple moved toward the spot where the guest had stood near the mantel. She looked down at the rug. The pile was dark and patterned. But near the edge, where the light from the lamp caught it, she saw a faint smear of wet, a small crescent of moisture, as if a shoe had pressed briefly and then lifted. She did not announce it. She did not point. She simply noted it. Then she looked at the window nearest the garden. The curtains were half drawn. The glass showed beads of rain. She leaned in slightly and saw that one corner of the latch was not fully settled. It was not open, but it was not fully closed either. Again, she did not announce it. She noted it. Dolly watched her aunt's face. Aunt Jane, what do you think? Miss Marple turned her eyes toward the room, toward the people who were now speaking in whispers. She saw Mrs. Price Ridley clutching her handbag as though it contained the whole world. She saw Colonel Havisham's jaw tightened with irritation that masked something else. She saw Reverend Granger's hands folded, prayerful, and yet his eyes were searching. Then Miss Marple looked at the empty place by the mantel. I think, she said softly, that he did not vanish by accident. Dolly swallowed. You mean he chose to go? Yes, Miss Marple replied. And I think he chose to do it quietly. So quietly that people would doubt themselves. The hostess stared at Miss Marple, lips pale. But why? Why would a man come to our house and then simply disappear? Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. There are many reasons. Some people disappear because they are afraid. Some disappear because they are guilty. Some disappear because they wish others to be afraid or guilty. And sometimes, she added, almost kindly, people disappear because they believe it will solve a problem. They forget that it often creates another. A hush settled. The rain continued its patient tapping outside. The clock ticked on. In that quiet, Miss Marple felt the first true shift of the evening. A gathering that had begun as a pleasant supper had become something else. A question had entered the house, and it would not leave until it was answered. And somewhere in the dark, wet garden, or perhaps beyond it, a man who had called himself Mr. Ambrose had stepped out of the story the village was trying to tell, leaving behind an empty space that would soon be filled with suspicion. Miss Marple folded her hands and looked at the faces around her. Human nature, she thought, was always most visible when comfort was disturbed. People revealed their hearts not when they were safe, but when they were uncertain. And this village, so tidy in daylight, was about to show what it kept hidden in the shadows. Chapter 2. The rain did not stop for anyone. It continued through the night with quiet persistence, as if the sky had decided that the earth required a thorough washing and would not be argued with. At Gossington Hall the lamps were turned lower, and the house settled into a strained sort of stillness, the kind that follows a disturbance when people are too polite to call it fear. By the time the constable arrived, the guests had been persuaded to return to their homes. They left in small groups, their voices muffled by coats and umbrellas, their curiosity pressed tightly beneath polite farewells. Dolly drove Miss Marple back through lanes that glistened like black ribbon. The car's tires whispered over wet gravel. Hedge shadows leaned close on either side, and every hedgerow seemed capable of hiding a pair of listening eyes. Dolly kept her hands firm on the wheel. "It feels wicked," she said. "As though we have left something unfinished behind us." "We have," Miss Marple replied, looking out at the rainy darkness. "A question has been set loose, and questions are very difficult to lock back in a cupboard." At St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's cottage appeared warm and small, a pocket of light against the gloom. She made Dolly a final cup of tea, more as comfort than necessity. Dolly spoke rapidly, as though words might keep the night from growing heavier. "They checked the rooms, Aunt Jane. They checked the garden. They even looked at the gate." The constable seemed almost offended by the idea that a man could vanish from a respectable house as if he were smoke. "He is used to problems with familiar shapes," Miss Marple said. "A missing cow, a broken window, a quarrel at the pub. A guest who disappears without noise is not one of his usual shapes." Dolly shivered. "I cannot help imagining him out there, soaked and slipping, perhaps hurt." Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful. "It is kind of you. But remember what you saw. He chose to go out. He did not rush. He did not call for help. He stepped away as calmly as a man stepping from one room to another." Dolly looked at her aunt. "So you think he planned it?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that he expected something. Whether it was a person, or a moment, or simply an opportunity, I do not know yet." Dolly sighed. "I shall not sleep." "You will," Miss Marple said, with quiet certainty. "You will eventually. Human beings cannot live on suspense. It is why we resolve mysteries in our minds even when there is no evidence. It is why gossip grows. It fills the gap that uncertainty leaves." After Dolly left, Miss Marple prepared for bed, but she did not hurry. She checked the latch on her own window. She set the kettle ready for morning. She placed her knitting in its basket. Then she lay down, listening to the rain, and allowed her thoughts to move in a slow, orderly way. There was a man who called himself Mr. Ambrose, a village that could not decide his name, a gathering where the man behaved correctly, a faint mark at the wrist, a window latch not fully settled, a wet smear on the rug. She did not force conclusions. It was too early. Conclusions forced too early often snapped like thread. But she held the details gently, as one might hold a fragile object, waiting for daylight. Morning arrived pale and quiet. The rain had weakened into a fine mist, and the world outside Miss Marple's window looked washed and newly serious. The lane was empty, but the village itself was not. Even before breakfast, St. Mary Mead had begun to hum. News travelled faster than birds in a village. Miss Marple did not need to step outside to know that people were speaking. She could feel it in the air, in the distant sound of a door opening and closing quickly, in the faint rise and fall of voices near the hedge. When she walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on, she found herself thinking, with a mild sadness, how quickly a community's attention could shift from the ordinary kindness of daily life to the sharp thrill of a disturbance. It was not cruelty. It was appetite, a hunger for meaning, even if the meaning had to be invented. She ate her breakfast simply, then put on her coat and hat. She would go to the village shop, she told herself, because she needed sugar. Sugar was useful. It also drew conversation as surely as honey drew bees. The lane was damp underfoot. A light mist hung low, softening edges. The hedgerows dripped. A robin hopped on the path, bright and cheeky, as if the night's drama had not concerned it at all. At the shop, the bell above the door rang, and Mrs. Hawes looked up with the speed of a woman prepared to receive news and distribute it. "Miss Marple," she said warmly, but her eyes were already sparkling. "You have heard, of course." "Good morning, Mrs. Hawes," Miss Marple replied. "Yes, I heard there was some excitement at Gossington." Mrs. Hawes leaned across the counter. "Excitement. That is one word. A man vanishes. Vanishes. Just like that. And in that house, too. You would think a house like that would not allow such things." Miss Marple selected a bag of sugar with calm deliberation. "Houses do not allow or forbid, Mrs. Hawes. People do." Mrs. Hawes did not quite hear, because she was already continuing. "They say he was a foreigner." "Do they?" Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes." Mrs. Price Ridley said his accent was not quite English. Miss Marple lifted her eyebrows. "Did Mrs. Price Ridley speak to him at length?" Mrs. Hawes hesitated. "Well, not at length, perhaps. But you can tell these things." Miss Marple nodded. "People often think they can. What else do they say?" Mrs. Hawes lowered her voice, though the shop was empty. "They say he left his luggage behind." "That seems likely," Miss Marple said. "And they say there was money in it. Do they know that?" Mrs. Hawes's eyes widened. "Well, you know how such things are. Someone saw the valet carrying it. A heavy case, they said." "Heavy cases often mean something valuable." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Or they mean shoes." Mrs. Hawes looked slightly disappointed by that, then recovered. "Anyway, the police have been called. The constable was there last night, and this morning they have sent for someone from Market Basing, a proper officer." Miss Marple paid for her sugar. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawes. I am sure the proper officer will be very helpful." As she turned to leave, Mrs. Hawes added, almost eagerly, "Do you think it is foul play, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple paused, her hand on the door. She chose her words carefully. "I think it is too early to decide. But I think it is unwise to assume that a polite man cannot also be a dangerous question." Outside, the mist felt cooler. Miss Marple walked slowly back along the lane. She passed the vicarage and saw Reverend Granger in his garden, pruning a bush as though shaping it might also shape his thoughts. He looked up, and his face carried the tired gentleness of someone who had spent the night worrying. "Miss Marple," he said. "Good morning." "Good morning, Vicar." She stopped. "Did you sleep at all?" He gave a small sigh. "A little. Not much. One keeps thinking of the man. If he is ill, as I understood, wandering out in such weather could be very dangerous." "Who told you he was ill?" Miss Marple asked gently. The vicar blinked. Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned it. She said he had been advised to rest in the country. Miss Marple nodded. "Did she say who advised him?" Reverend Granger frowned. "No, she did not. I suppose I assumed a doctor." "We assume many things," Miss Marple said softly. The vicar looked troubled. There is something else. I heard a remark last night. Colonel Havisham said the man knew about the old court case, the one years ago. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. Which case? The vicar hesitated. The matter of Mr. Lester's land, the dispute that nearly tore two families apart. It was quite unpleasant. People do not speak of it now. And the guest knew of it? So Colonel Havisham said. And he seemed surprised. Miss Marple thanked the vicar and continued on. She felt that small click in her mind. The click that came when two details touched and did not yet fit, but promised they would. By midday, the proper officer had arrived. The village watched from behind curtains, from shop doorways, from the corners of lanes. A car with official seriousness drove toward Gossington Hall. The air seemed to tighten around it. Dolly arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with the strain of sleeplessness. They want statements, she said. Everyone who spoke to him. Everyone who saw him. Aunt Jane. Will you come? I know you noticed things. Miss Marple put down her teacup. Yes, dear. I will come. They drove again through damp lanes to Gossington Hall. In daylight, the house looked perfectly ordinary, as if last night's mystery had been a dream. But inside, the atmosphere was different. Curtains were half-drawn. The servants moved quickly and quietly. Every sound seemed to carry farther than it should. In the small morning room, a man sat at a table with papers. He was not the local constable. He had the composed authority of someone who belonged to procedures. He stood when Miss Marple entered. Miss Marple, Dolly said quickly. This is Inspector Craddock from Market Basing. Inspector Craddock had thoughtful eyes and a manner that was courteous without softness. Miss Marple. I understand you were present last night. I was, Miss Marple said. He gestured to a chair. Please sit. I would like your account. Miss Marple sat neatly. She did not dramatize. She described the evening as she had experienced it, the guests' calm departure, the delay before concern, the searches, the window latch that was not fully settled, the smear of moisture on the rug. Inspector Craddock's pen paused briefly at that. You noticed the latch? Yes. Was the window opened? It was not open when I saw it, but it was not fully secured. He nodded. And the mark on his wrist you mentioned to Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple did not look surprised that he knew. Yes. A faint line. Perhaps a scar. Inspector Craddock leaned back slightly. We have checked his room. His luggage is indeed still there. Inside there are shirts, a shaving kit, and a small notebook. The notebook contains nothing but a list of names, some of which belong to people in this district. Miss Marple's face remained calm. Which names? Inspector Craddock's eyes held hers. Among them are Bantry, Price Ridley, Havisham, and Granger. Dolly gave a small gasp. Miss Marple felt the chill of significance. A guest who arrived with a list of names, and then disappeared. Inspector Craddock's voice remained steady. So, Miss Marple, tell me, in your opinion, did this man leave of his own accord, or was he taken? Miss Marple looked at him with quiet clarity. Inspector, I think he wanted to vanish. The question is whether he succeeded alone, or whether someone helped him, or whether someone decided to take advantage of his plan. Inspector Craddock's gaze sharpened. That is an interesting distinction. It is often the correct one, Miss Marple replied. Human nature likes opportunity. If a door is left ajar, someone will eventually step through it, even if they did not open it. Inspector Craddock nodded slowly, as if setting her words in place. Then we shall look for doors left ajar. Outside, the mist had begun to lift. The lawn shone damply. The world looked innocent again. But inside the house, the absence of one man had become a presence of its own. And Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap, understood that the village would not return to calm until that presence had been named. The morning room at Gossington Hall held a quiet tension that had nothing to do with its furniture. It was a pleasant room in any ordinary week, with pale curtains, a small writing desk, and a view across the damp lawn. Today it felt like a courtroom dressed in soft colors. Papers lay on the table in neat stacks. A fire burned, but the warmth did not quite reach the corners. Inspector Craddock moved with unhurried precision, as if he were placing each fact into a separate drawer. Miss Marple watched him with a gentle curiosity. She had met many policemen in her time. Some were brash, some were kind, some were clever, and some were clever only in ways that pleased themselves. Inspector Craddock, she thought, had the advantage of listening. He looked down at the notebook again. This list of names, Miss Marple. You said you noticed the man was careful. Did he seem interested in particular people? Interested, Miss Marple repeated, tasting the word. He spoke to many. But he listened more than he spoke, and he watched the room as though he were checking that everyone was present. Craddock's eyes lifted. Checking. Miss Marple nodded, like a person reading a guest list at the door, making sure no one is missing. Or perhaps making sure someone is there. Dolly shifted in her chair, restless. Aunt Jane, you make it sound as though he had a purpose, not simply a visit. Miss Marple looked at her niece with kindness. Most visits have purposes, dear. Even if the purpose is only to be admired. Craddock tapped the notebook lightly with his pen. We have found no identification in his luggage. No letters. No passport. Only these clothes, ordinary enough, and a small amount of cash. He registered under the name Ambrose. An invented name, Dolly said. Possibly, Craddock replied. Possibly not. But it is inconveniently common. Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful. May I ask, Inspector, what did the staff say? Did anyone see him leave? Craddock shook his head. No. The maid in the hall saw him pass toward the rear corridor. She assumed he was going to the lavatory or into the library. No one saw him go out the front. No one saw him go out the back. The doors were not locked. In a house like this, people come and go. It is not like a small cottage. Miss Marple considered that. He could have slipped out easily enough, especially if he knew where he was going. Exactly, Craddock said. But then there is the garden. We looked this morning. There were no clear prints from the house to the gate. Of course, the rain may have washed them. Or he did not use the gate, Miss Marple said gently. Craddock's pen paused. You suspect the window. I suspect it was part of his path, Miss Marple replied. Perhaps he opened it. Perhaps he meant to. Perhaps someone else did. But it was not properly secured. Craddock nodded once. We will examine it carefully. A servant entered, murmured something into the inspector's ear, and left again. Craddock's expression tightened slightly, the way a man's face did when another drawer had been opened and the contents were unpleasant. Colonel Havisham, he said. He is ready to speak. And Mrs. Price Ridley as well. Dolly made a small noise of irritation. She will be dramatic. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Drama is often a way of hiding what one truly feels. Craddock rose. If you will excuse me. As he left the room, Dolly leaned toward her aunt. Aunt Jane, that notebook. A list of names. Why would he have that? Miss Marple folded her hands. Perhaps he was planning to meet them. Perhaps he was planning to judge them. Or perhaps, she added gently, he was planning to frighten them. Dolly swallowed. Frighten them into what? Into revealing themselves, Miss Marple said. People often reveal far more under the pressure of fear than they do under the pressure of manners. Dolly stared at the fire as if she might see answers in it. I do not like it. No, Miss Marple agreed softly. It is not meant to be liked. They waited. Through the quiet walls of the house, Miss Marple could hear faint voices. Colonel Havisham's deeper tone, Mrs. Price Ridley's quick flutters, the inspector's calm questions. The house seemed to be listening along with her. After some time, Craddock returned. His expression remained controlled, but Miss Marple could see the faint sharpening of his attention, the sign that something had been said that mattered. He sat again. Colonel Havisham confirms he spoke with the man near the fire. He says the man seemed well informed about local history, such as the land dispute, Miss Marple said. Craddock nodded. Yes, the Leicester matter. Havisham claims he was surprised the man even knew of it. He says he asked him where he had heard, and the man only smiled and said that villagers keep their stories. Miss Marple's gaze was gentle, a true remark. Craddock continued. Mrs. Price Ridley is of the opinion that the man was a distant cousin of the Bantry family. Dolly snorted. Of course she is. Craddock glanced at Dolly, unimpressed by snorts. She also says she noticed nothing unusual about him. She says he left the room for a moment, and that was all. Miss Marple spoke quietly. She would say that, Inspector. It is comfortable to believe nothing unusual happened. It allows one to feel safe. Craddock's eyes narrowed slightly. You think she knows more? I think she knows something, Miss Marple corrected. Perhaps not more. But something. There is a difference. Craddock's gaze held hers. In your experience, Miss Marple, when a man disappears from a gathering, what is the most common reason? Miss Marple answered without hesitation. Shame. Dolly blinked. Shame? Yes, Miss Marple said. Shame makes people run. Shame makes people hide. Shame makes people create new names and new lives. It is powerful, because it is not always deserved. But it is felt as if it is. Craddock leaned forward. And in this case? In this case, Miss Marple said softly, I do not know yet whose shame it is. The missing man's, or someone else's. A maid returned with a tray of tea. Even in crisis, tea arrived. It was one of the steady mercies of England. Miss Marple accepted a cup, letting the warmth settle in her hands. Craddock took his cup without drinking. We have sent for a photographer to take pictures of the room and window. We will also question the staff again. And I have asked the constable to check railway stations and coach stops. Dolly's eyes widened. You think he left by train? It is possible, Craddock said. If he had a coat waiting somewhere. If he had arranged transport. A man can vanish easily if he does not mind leaving his possessions behind. Miss Marple nodded. Some people leave behind possessions to make a point. They want others to know the vanishing is not accidental. They want it to feel impossible. Craddock's gaze sharpened. And why would someone want that? Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Because it forces attention. Because it forces questions. Because it forces people to look at what they have avoided. Dolly whispered. The old dispute, perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or something even older. Craddock exhaled slowly. You seem to think the village is involved. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. A village is always involved, Inspector. Even when it pretends not to be. Villages are like families. They keep secrets together. They also punish anyone who threatens to expose them. Craddock sat back, considering. Then we must determine what secret he threatened. Miss Marple sipped her tea, and whether his disappearance was his own choice or the village's. At that moment, footsteps sounded in the hall, quick and purposeful. The local constable entered, hat in hand, cheeks reddened from cold. Inspector, he said, we found something by the side path near the yew hedge. Craddock's eyes snapped into focus. What? The constable held out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it carefully. Inside lay a cufflink, plain silver, with a simple engraved letter A. Dolly's breath caught. It's his... Craddock's face remained controlled, but Miss Marple saw the subtle tension in his jaw. A small object, easily overlooked, but heavy with meaning. "Where exactly?" Craddock demanded. "Near the yew hedge, sir," the constable said. "Caught in the mud beside the stones. The rain must have washed it out." Miss Marple looked at the cufflink, her expression gentle but inwardly alert. A cufflink was not something most men lost by accident without noticing. It suggested movement, perhaps hurried movement, or struggle, or a deliberate dropping, a breadcrumb laid on purpose. Craddock wrapped it again and stood. "Take me there." He looked at Miss Marple. "Would you like to come?" Miss Marple rose. "Yes," she said quietly. "I would." They walked out into the damp air. The mist clung to the lawn like a thin veil. The yew hedge stood dark and dense, its branches heavy with moisture. The stones of the path shone. It was peaceful, almost beautiful, the kind of beauty that could make one forget how easily something dreadful might happen in a quiet place. The constable led them to the spot. The mud beside the stones was disturbed in small, uneven patches. Miss Marple bent slightly, careful not to step on anything. She did not need to touch the ground to see what mattered. The mud showed faint marks, not clear footprints, not enough for certainty, but enough for suggestion. A toe pressed hard. A heel slipped. A second mark close beside it. Dolly whispered. There was someone else. Miss Marple did not answer with certainty. She answered with observation. There was movement. More than one movement. Craddock stared at the ground, then at the hedge. If he went through here, he could have reached the side gate. The side gate was locked, the constable said. But the fence beyond has a weak spot. Old boards. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Then he could have slipped through there and reached the lane. Miss Marple looked at the hedge, then beyond it toward the line of trees. In her mind, she saw the man from last night. Calm, composed, stepping away. And now she saw the mud, the cufflink, the faint suggestion of haste. A thought settled in her, quiet and cold. A man might plan to vanish. But a plan could be interrupted. Human nature did not always allow careful departures. Sometimes it forced faster ones. Miss Marple straightened slowly, the damp air brushing her cheeks. Inspector, she said softly, a cufflink is not merely a clue. It is a message. The question is whether the message was left by choice, or by accident, or by someone who wished us to follow. Craddock looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Then we will follow, he said. And as they stood there beside the yew hedge, in the quiet damp of a winter morning, Miss Marple understood that the village was no longer simply curious. It was involved. And the missing guest, wherever he was, had already succeeded in one thing. He had made everyone look. Chapter 3. By the third day, the disappearance had stopped feeling like an incident and begun to feel like weather. It had seeped into everything. It was spoken of over teacups, whispered at garden gates, and carried like a small secret parcel from one person to the next. St. Mary Mead did not have to choose to gossip. It simply breathed, and gossip arrived. The morning was cold but clear. The rain had finally moved on, leaving the lanes slick and shining. Winter sunlight lay thinly on the roofs, and the hedgerows glittered with leftover drops. It ought to have been a peaceful scene. It ought to have been the sort of morning that made people grateful for ordinary life. Instead, the village looked as if it were holding its breath. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the shop again, not because she needed anything urgent, but because the village always gathered there, in one way or another. She moved with the quiet composure that made people talk freely in her presence, as though her gentleness promised that nothing they said would be used against them. It was not that she encouraged unkindness. She simply encouraged truth, and truth often arrived disguised as chatter. Outside the shop, she saw two women already talking. Mrs. Bartlett, wrapped in a thick scarf, and Mrs. Price Ridley, upright as a flagpole and twice as rigid. Their voices softened when they noticed Miss Marple, then rose again as if their caution had been only a polite pause. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bartlett said with warmth, "we were just saying how dreadful it all is." Mrs. Price Ridley nodded solemnly. "A most disturbing occurrence. One cannot have people disappearing like that. It makes one wonder what the world is coming to." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "The world has always had people disappearing, Mrs. Price Ridley. It is only that most of the time we do not notice." Mrs. Price Ridley looked faintly offended by the suggestion that history had been untidy. "Well, this is different," she insisted. "This is a gentleman, in a respectable house." Miss Marple stepped closer, hands folded neatly in front of her coat. "And yet, even respectable houses have corridors, and corridors have shadows." Mrs. Bartlett's eyes widened. "Do you think he was taken, Miss Marple? Do you think someone dragged him away?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "Tell me, Mrs. Bartlett, what did you hear? I find it helps to know what people are saying." Mrs. Bartlett looked pleased to be asked. "Oh, all sorts. Mrs. Hawes says he was foreign. Mrs. Allen says he was a cousin of the Bantrys. Mrs. Pierce swears she heard he was connected to a court case." Mrs. Price Ridley cleared her throat sharply, the sound of authority being polished. "That is nonsense. I never said he was foreign. I said his accent was a little unusual. There is a difference." Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "What was unusual about it?" Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated. "I cannot quite say. It was not broad. It was quite refined, but not exactly what one expects." "And what does one expect?" Miss Marple asked, still mild. Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened. "English." Miss Marple nodded as if agreeing, though she was not. "You spoke with him for some time." "Well, not some time. But I did speak." Mrs. Price Ridley brightened slightly. "I spoke to him about the village, about the church fete, about how peaceful it is." "And what did he say?" Mrs. Price Ridley smiled with the satisfaction of recalling a compliment. "He said villages keep their stories. He said it in a very thoughtful way." Miss Marple's gaze rested on her face. "Did he ask about any particular story?" Mrs. Price Ridley's smile faltered. "Not directly. He did not need to. One could tell he was intelligent." Miss Marple let that settle. People often used the word intelligent when they meant unsettling. Inside the shop, the bell rang as the door opened, and another customer entered. It was Colonel Havisham, cheeks briskly red, moustache bristling, as if it could defend him from the village's questions. He nodded to Miss Marple, but his eyes held the uneasy brightness of a man who had spent too long being asked what he knew. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "Good morning, Colonel," she replied. "How are you managing in all this excitement?" His jaw tightened. "Nonsense, really. A man goes off. He will turn up. Do you think he will?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Colonel Havisham hesitated. It was a small hesitation, but it was enough. "He must," he said at last, "unless he has done something foolish." Mrs. Bartlett leaned forward. "They say he knew about the Leicester land dispute." "Colonel." Colonel Havisham's eyes flashed with irritation. "They say too much. People speak as if they have facts when they have only imagination." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "And yet you did say he spoke of it." Colonel Havisham looked at her sharply, then softened. Miss Marple's soft tone often had that effect. It made harshness feel unnecessary. "Yes," he admitted. "He mentioned it, only in passing. He said something about how villages remember. It was damned odd. I asked him how he knew, and he did not answer." Mrs. Price Ridley lifted her chin. "Perhaps he read it somewhere." Colonel Havisham made a dismissive sound. "Who reads that sort of thing?" Miss Marple looked from one face to another. Here were three people, each holding a different version of the missing man. Foreign, cousin, informed stranger, refined gentleman. Each version was shaped by the speaker's preferences and fears. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, was always eager to turn a person into a category. It made the world easier to manage. If he was a cousin, the village could treat him as family trouble. If he was foreign, the village could treat him as outsider danger. If he was a man with knowledge, the village could treat him as a threat. She thanked them and bought her small items. As she left, she heard Mrs. Bartlett whispering already, smoothing the conversation into a story that could be carried. Outside, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the lane that led to the vicarage. She had been thinking about Reverend Granger's remark, about old stories people did not speak of now. She had also been thinking about the notebook in the luggage, the list of names. A man did not write down names in that manner, unless he intended to do something with them. Speak to them, confront them, or measure them against something that mattered. The vicar was in his study when she arrived, surrounded by books and the faint smell of dust and paper. He rose politely, though his face showed strain. "Miss Marple," he said, "please sit. I am glad you came. I find the atmosphere in the village most unsettling." Miss Marple sat. "The atmosphere is unsettled because people cannot decide what to believe." The vicar sighed. "Inspector Craddock asked me questions again this morning. He asked about the Leicester dispute. He asked about old tensions. It is all so unpleasant. Unpleasant things do not cease to exist, because we prefer not to speak of them," Miss Marple said softly. The vicar nodded reluctantly. "True. I fear we have made ourselves vulnerable. When people do not resolve old wrongs, they remain ready to be used." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Tell me about the Leicester dispute, Vicar. Not the official facts. The human facts." Reverend Granger hesitated. It was many years ago. A boundary disagreement at first, then money, then pride. Mr. Leicester believed a strip of land belonged to his family. Colonel Havisham's father disagreed. There was a court case. It dragged on. It ruined friendships. It made neighbors avoid one another. In the end, Mr. Leicester lost. He died not long after. "And his family?" Miss Marple asked. The vicar's gaze dropped. His wife left the village. The son, Edwin, went away. People said he was bitter. People said he made threats. But it was all talk, and then the village moved on. Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful. Moved on? Or covered it over? The vicar did not answer, because the answer was too obvious. Miss Marple rose. "Thank you, Vicar." As she left the vicarage, she felt that gentle tightening in her mind again. A son who left bitter. A dispute that tore the village. Names on a list. A guest who arrived with careful politeness, then vanished into the wet night. At the end of the lane, she saw Inspector Craddock's car parked near the green. The inspector himself stood speaking to the local constable. He turned when he saw Miss Marple, and for a moment his composed face softened into something close to gratitude. Not many people in a village were useful to an inspector. Most were obstacles. Miss Marple, he suspected, was neither. "Miss Marple," he said, "just the person I wanted to see." "Good morning, Inspector," she replied. He walked with her a little way, away from the constable's listening ear. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "We have several," Miss Marple corrected gently. Craddock's mouth tightened, almost a smile. "True, but this one is particular. Every witness gives a different description of the man's story. Different name, different reason for his visit, different connection to the household. It is as though the village is describing 3 different men, or as though the man encouraged 3 different stories," Miss Marple said calmly. Craddock's gaze sharpened. "Exactly. That is what troubles me. It suggests intention." Miss Marple looked at the winter sunlight on the damp grass. "When people cannot agree on the facts, Inspector, they begin to argue about motives. And motives are far more dangerous." Craddock nodded slowly. "I want you to tell me something. You met him. You watched him. Did he seem nervous?" Miss Marple considered. He was controlled. Nervousness often shows itself in small betrayals. A tapping hand, a restless glance. He did not have those. But control can be another form of nervousness. It is simply nervousness trained to sit still. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Then he was afraid. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, or perhaps he wanted others to be afraid. Craddock exhaled. We checked railway stations. No one remembers him. We checked inns. Nothing. He has vanished in a manner that is almost too neat. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Neatness is often a sign of planning, but sometimes it is also a sign of people not looking in the right place. They look where they expect a man to go, not where he truly would. Craddock turned his head toward her. And where would he truly go? Miss Marple did not answer with certainty. She offered what she had learned from human nature. Toward whoever is most afraid of him, or toward whoever he believes owes him something. Craddock's gaze held hers. Then, we must determine who that is. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector. And to do that, you must listen not only to what people say, but to what they cannot bring themselves to say. As they stood there, the village around them continued to appear calm. Birds hopped. Smoke rose. A dog barked once, and then stopped, and yet beneath all of it, the story of the vanishing guest was being rewritten by every mouth that spoke it. Miss Marple felt, with quiet certainty, that the third day was when a mystery began to harden. It was when people's versions became loyalties. It was when a question stopped being curious and started being personal. And when a mystery became personal, someone almost always made a mistake. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visitor she had not expected. It was not Dolly, though Dolly's anxious energy seemed to hover over the village like a restless bird. It was not Mrs. Hawes, who usually arrived with news before the kettle could boil. It was a young woman in a plain coat, her cheeks pale from cold, and her eyes wary in the way of someone who had been told not to trust easily. She stood in Miss Marple's doorway, as if unsure whether to enter. "Miss Marple?" she asked. "Yes, dear." The young woman stepped in, removing her gloves with careful fingers. "My name is Rose Lester." Miss Marple's mind noted the name instantly, but her face remained gentle. "Please sit, Miss Lester. Would you like some tea?" Rose sat as though the chair might accuse her. "No, thank you. I do not think I could swallow anything." Miss Marple sat opposite her. "You have come about the missing man." Rose's lips pressed together. "They say he knew about my family. They say many things," Miss Marple replied softly. "Tell me what you know." Rose stared at her hands. "My father was Edwin Lester." Miss Marple nodded. "Edwin, bitter son. A man who left," Rose continued, voice tight but controlled. "He died 2 years ago. Not here. Away. He never returned to St. Mary Mead, not truly. He spoke of it as if it were a wound that never healed." Miss Marple watched her quietly. "And you believe the vanishing guest is connected?" Rose's eyes lifted, shining. "I do not believe. I am afraid." Fear, Miss Marple thought, was the most honest emotion, because it did not bother to dress itself up. It arrived bare. Rose leaned forward. "Miss Marple, there was a letter, 2 weeks ago. A letter came to me. No return address. It said only that someone intended to settle the old account. It said the village had lived too comfortably with what it had done." Miss Marple's tone remained calm. "Did it name anyone?" Rose shook her head. "No. But it spoke of the land. It spoke of a court. It spoke of a man who smiled while he ruined another man." Miss Marple thought of Colonel Havisham, laughing too loudly. She thought of Mrs. Price Ridley clinging to civility like armor. She thought of the list of names. And then the man arrived at Gossington Hall. Rose said. And then he vanished. Everyone is pretending it is a puzzle. But it feels like a threat. It feels like the first move in something. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. Why did you come to me, dear, rather than Inspector Craddock? Rose's mouth twisted. Because the inspector will want facts, and I have only feelings. And because people tell stories about you. They say you notice what others miss. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. That is generous of them. Feelings are not nothing, Miss Lester. Feelings are often the shadow cast by truth. Rose's shoulders trembled slightly. Do you think someone harmed him? Miss Marple considered. It is possible. But it is also possible that he wished to be thought harmed. There is power in making people imagine the worst. Rose swallowed. My father used to say the village would pay one day. Miss Marple nodded slowly. People who feel wronged often imagine payment. But payment rarely arrives in the form they expect. It arrives in human choices. Rose stood abruptly, as if sitting still made her fear heavier. If something happens, if the inspector asks, will you tell him about the letter? Miss Marple looked at her kindly. I will tell him that you are frightened. I will tell him why. But you should also consider telling him yourself. Inspectors may prefer facts, but good ones do not ignore fear. Fear is evidence of pressure. Rose hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. When she left, Miss Marple remained sitting for a long moment, staring at her knitting basket without seeing it. The Lester name had entered her cottage like a gust of cold air. It had connected the missing guest to a buried grievance. Not in a vague way now, but with a direct thread. She rose and went to the window. The lane was quiet, but she could see Mrs. Bartlett across the way, speaking to a neighbor and glancing, as people now did, toward every passing figure. Miss Marple thought about the letter. Anonymous, accusatory, carefully worded to awaken old guilt. And then a guest arriving with a list of names. That evening, Inspector Craddock came to see her, as if the day had arranged it. He entered her sitting room, removed his hat, and looked at her with that calm alertness of his. You have heard more, he said, not accusing, simply observing. Miss Marple poured him tea. Yes, Inspector, Rose Lester came to see me. Craddock's eyes narrowed slightly. What did she say? Miss Marple told him. The letter, the tone, the fear. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She simply placed the facts gently on the table, like pieces of china. Craddock listened, expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. So, he said at last, we may be dealing with someone using the Lester grievance as a lever. Or someone who genuinely believes in it, Miss Marple said. Sometimes people do dreadful things from genuine belief. Craddock nodded slowly. I spoke with Colonel Havisham again. He insists the dispute was settled legally. He insists the Lesters were foolish to fight it. Miss Marple's voice remained mild. Legal settlements and human settlements are not always the same. Craddock's gaze held hers. What about the cufflink? We traced it. It is not an expensive piece. It was bought in London, in a shop that sells ordinary gentlemen's things. The clerk remembers the man. He bought it as part of a set, but only took one pair, and paid cash. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Only one pair? Yes, Craddock said, as if he wanted a single initial, not a full set. A, Miss Marple murmured. That can be Ambrose, or Armitage, or Andrew, or any number of convenient names. Craddock nodded. Exactly. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Inspector, the village is creating stories because it cannot tolerate a blank space. But the man himself created the blank space. He is controlling what they imagine. Craddock leaned forward. Then how do we take control back? Miss Marple looked at him with quiet steadiness. By finding the one person whose story does not change. The one person who does not benefit from imagination. The one person who is frightened for a reason, not for entertainment. Craddock's eyes sharpened. Rose Lester. Yes, Miss Marple said. And also the servants. Craddock frowned slightly. The servants? Miss Marple nodded. Servants see what guests do when they think no one important is watching, and they often hear what is said when people believe the hallway is empty. Craddock sat back, considering. We have questioned them. Question them again, Miss Marple said softly. But do not ask them what they saw. Ask them what felt odd. Ask them what did not fit. People who are used to routine notice disturbances like a cracked note in music. Craddock was quiet, then nodded once. I will. He stood to leave, then paused. Miss Marple, you said earlier that when a mystery becomes personal, someone makes a mistake. Yes, she replied. Craddock's eyes were thoughtful. Whose mistake are we waiting for? Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the evening light had begun to fade. The mistake of the person who thinks the village will protect them. Or the mistake of the person who believes they can frighten others without being frightened themselves. Craddock put on his hat. I hope it is the second. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were serious. So do I, Inspector. Because the first mistake is often made by someone who has been wrong for a long time. And people who have been wrong for a long time do not always choose gentle methods when they finally act. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat again by the fire. The room was warm, the kettle humming softly. Outside, the village lights began to glow one by one. It looked peaceful, almost tender. But inside that tenderness, old anger had stirred. Someone had written a letter. Someone had arrived with a list of names. Someone had vanished in a way designed to unsettle. And somewhere, Miss Marple felt sure, a person was watching the village watch itself, waiting to see who would reveal what they were trying to hide. In mysteries, she reflected, the most dangerous thing was not the unknown. It was the moment when the unknown began to feel known, when people thought they understood, and therefore stopped being careful. That was when mistakes happened. And that was when the truth, so often quiet, finally stepped into the light. Chapter 4. The fourth day arrived with a brightness that felt almost improper. The sky was clear, the hedgerows were crisp, and the winter sunlight made the damp grass sparkle as if the village had decided to dress itself up and pretend nothing was wrong. The air held that clean, sharp scent that followed rain, and the roofs shone faintly where the moisture still clung. Miss Marple had learned long ago that fine weather did not prevent bad things. It simply made them look out of place. She was sitting by her window with her knitting when she saw Inspector Craddock's car pass along the lane, moving more slowly than usual. It did not stop at her gate. It continued toward the vicarage, then turned toward the green. The inspector was searching, she thought, not for the missing man in a physical sense, but for the shape of the truth. And the truth, as always, would not be found where people wanted it to be. A little later, she received a note delivered by hand. The handwriting was careful and slightly old-fashioned, the sort that belonged to someone who believed in proper spacing and the authority of capital letters. Miss Marple opened it and read, Miss Marple, if you have time, could you come to Gossington Hall this afternoon? There is a matter connected with the past, and I believe you may understand its importance. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Bantry. It was polite. It was also urgent. Mrs. Bantry was not a woman who summoned guests for trivial reasons. Miss Marple folded the note, placed her knitting aside, and put on her coat. The drive to Gossington Hall felt quieter than usual. The lanes were empty, as though the village had paused to listen. When she arrived, the house looked calm from the outside, but inside it carried a strain that could not be hidden by polished floors. Mrs. Bantry met her in the entrance hall. She was a composed woman, but Miss Marple noticed how she held her hands, clasped a little too tightly, as if her fingers were afraid to let go. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming." Her voice was steady, but not quite as warm as usual. "We have found something. Or rather, we have remembered something." "Remembered?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "That can be more revealing than finding." Mrs. Bantry nodded, then led her into a small sitting room away from the main corridor. The curtains were half drawn. A fire burned. On a table lay an old leather folder, worn at the edges, the sort of thing that had been opened many times, and then put away with determination. Mrs. Bantry sat, as if the folder itself made her tired. "Inspector Craddock has been asking questions about the Leicester affair. He made me think. I had not wanted to think about it, if I am honest." Miss Marple's eyes were kind. "Most people do not." Mrs. Bantry touched the folder. "This belonged to my late husband. He kept papers. He was careful. This contains notes about the boundary dispute. Letters. A copy of a statement made in court." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And why does it matter now?" Mrs. Bantry looked at her, and in her eyes was something close to shame. "Because there was a witness statement that was never fully spoken of in the village. It was quietly understood." Miss Marple waited. She did not fill silences. Silences often delivered truth when one allowed them room. Mrs. Bantry opened the folder slowly and drew out a folded letter. The paper was yellowed. The ink had faded in places, but the words were still legible. "This is from Mr. Leicester," Mrs. Bantry said. "Edwin Leicester's father. He wrote it after the court case, before he died." Miss Marple read the letter carefully. It was written in a strained hand, full of bitterness and dignity. It spoke of being ruined, of being laughed at, of being betrayed by someone who had promised help. At one point, the letter mentioned a name. Not Colonel Havisham's father, not a lawyer, but someone else. A man who had been present in the village at that time. Someone who had offered to advise, to mediate, to guide. Someone who had smiled warmly and then turned away when it mattered. Miss Marple looked up. This name. Mrs. Bantry's face tightened. "Yes, it is still someone in the village," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Bantry nodded. "It is, and if the missing guest knew about the Leicester matter, perhaps he knew about this as well." Miss Marple sat back, letting the connection settle. The village had not only wronged the Leicester family through the legal dispute, it had also allowed a personal betrayal to take root. A betrayal that had been politely ignored. A betrayal that could now be used. "Who else has seen this letter?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "Only me. And Arthur, long ago. He said we should leave it. He said old wounds do not heal when one keeps picking at them." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "Old wounds do not heal when one pretends they never existed either." Mrs. Bantry exhaled slowly. "Inspector Craddock is coming later. I will show him. But Miss Marple, I wanted to show you first, because I fear the village will not react kindly if this becomes known." Miss Marple nodded. She understood. Villages protected their own. They also protected their reputations. And reputations were often more fragile than truth. As she spoke, there was a knock at the door. A maid entered, slightly breathless. "Madam, Inspector Craddock is here, and Miss Leicester is with him." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Rose Leicester? Here?" The maid nodded. "Yes, madam. She is in the morning room." Miss Marple rose. "Then the past is not merely being remembered," she said softly. "It is arriving." They went to the morning room. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace. Rose Leicester sat stiffly in a chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, but there was a stubborn steadiness in her eyes now, as if fear had burned into resolve. Craddock turned as Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry." Rose looked up quickly. When she saw Miss Marple, her shoulders loosened slightly, as though she had been holding herself upright by sheer will. Craddock spoke without preamble. "Miss Lester has received another letter." Rose held out an envelope. It was plain, no return address. The handwriting was careful, almost elegant. Craddock opened it and read aloud, his voice controlled. "You have waited long enough. The village will remember what it chose to forget. Tonight the truth will step into the open. If you are wise, you will be present." Rose swallowed. "It came this morning." Mrs. Bantry looked shaken. "This is madness." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "It is not madness, Mrs. Bantry. It is pressure." Craddock's eyes were sharp. "Pressure to do what?" Miss Marple looked at the letter, then at the faces around her. "To force someone to speak. To force a confession. Or to force a confrontation." Rose's voice trembled slightly, but she held it steady. "My father wanted a confession. He wanted someone to admit they betrayed him." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And did he ever receive it?" Rose shook her head. "No. He died still waiting." Craddock folded the letter. "Who is writing these?" Rose's eyes flashed with pain. "I do not know. But whoever it is knows the old details, knows the bitterness, knows the names." Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Bantry. "The letter you showed me, the name mentioned there. That could be the key." Mrs. Bantry looked as if she wanted to refuse, to protect herself and the village. But she was also a decent woman, and decency often forced difficult choices. "Yes," she said quietly. "Inspector, there is something you should see." Craddock listened as she explained the old folder, the letter from Mr. Lester, the hinted betrayal. His face grew more serious with each sentence. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "So," he said at last, "we have a historical grievance, a personal betrayal, and now a modern series of anonymous letters stirring it all up. And a man who arrived with a list of names, and then vanished." He looked at Miss Marple. "Do you see the pattern?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes. Someone is gathering the village's old sins and arranging them like props on a stage." Rose's voice was very quiet, "And they want me to watch." Miss Marple turned to her with gentle firmness. "They want you to be the spark. They want your pain to ignite the village. That is why you must be careful, because human nature, when heated, often burns the wrong person." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Tonight," he said. "The letter says tonight." Miss Marple looked toward the window, where sunlight lay deceptively warm on the lawn. "Then we must be ready. The past is not finished with St. Mary Mead. It has simply been waiting for someone to knock." By late afternoon, the village had begun to sense something, without knowing what. It was the way people moved, slightly faster than usual. It was the way conversations stopped when someone unexpected approached. It was the way curtains twitched and then stilled. A message had not been delivered to every house, but tension did not require formal invitations. It spread through instinct. Inspector Craddock had arranged for Rose Lester to stay at Gossington Hall for the evening, partly for protection, and partly because the letter demanded her presence. Mrs. Bantry, pale with worry, insisted on it as though hospitality could serve as armor. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room with Dolly, who had arrived as soon as she heard Rose was at the house. "This is like a play," Dolly whispered, eyes wide. "A dreadful play where someone has written the script and everyone is walking into their parts." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "It is exactly like that, dear. The danger is that some people enjoy playing parts more than they enjoy being safe." Dolly glanced toward Rose, who sat near the window, staring out at the darkening lawn. "She is so young. It feels unfair." "It often is," Miss Marple said softly. "Grievances rarely choose their heirs kindly." In another part of the house, Craddock and the local constable were questioning servants again, quietly and carefully. Miss Marple knew the inspector's methods would be thorough. But she also knew the human heart was not always revealed by direct questions. Sometimes it revealed itself through small slips, small reactions, the moments when someone believed they were not being tested. As dusk fell, the house seemed to grow larger. Shadows gathered in corners. Lamps glowed. Outside, the winter sky deepened into a cold blue. The garden became a dark shape beyond the glass. Mrs. Bantry entered, carrying the old folder. She looked as though she had aged in a few hours. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "I keep thinking about that letter from Mr. Lester. I keep thinking about how he wrote of betrayal, how he wrote of being laughed at." Miss Marple nodded. People can endure loss. They can endure defeat. But being laughed at wounds them in a different way. Mrs. Bantry sat, hands trembling slightly on the folder. "Arthur always said the village was too hard on the Lesters. He said pride made people cruel. And yet we did nothing. We let it all settle like dust." Miss Marple's eyes were kind. "We all let dust settle, Mrs. Bantry. The trouble is that dust does not disappear. It merely waits." A clock chimed softly in the hall. 8 o'clock. Rose shifted in her chair, as if the sound struck her physically. Dolly reached over and placed a hand on her arm, a rare gesture of tenderness from someone who usually lived at a brisk, cheerful distance. Craddock entered the drawing-room then, his face composed, but alert. He addressed them quietly. "We will not announce anything to the village. We do not want crowds. But we will be ready. There are officers outside the gates, and one at the side lane. If whoever wrote those letters expects a spectacle, they will be disappointed." Miss Marple looked at him. "Are you certain they want a spectacle? Or do they want a private confrontation?" Craddock's jaw tightened. "Either way, we will be present." Miss Marple nodded. She admired his readiness. But she also knew that readiness sometimes made people too confident. Human nature had a habit of slipping past confidence like water past a stone. The house waited. Minutes moved slowly. The fire crackled softly. A servant brought tea, though few drank it. The atmosphere was thick, not with noise, but with expectation. At 8:30, a faint sound came from the hallway, a soft thud, as if something had been placed down. Carefully, but firmly. Craddock moved first, crossing the room with quiet speed. Miss Marple followed more slowly, her heart steady. Dolly clung to Rose's arm, as if afraid Rose might vanish too. In the hallway, on the polished floor near the coat stand, lay a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. It had not been there moments before. No one had seen anyone enter. The servants, gathered at a distance, stared at it, as if it might bite. Craddock crouched, examining it without touching. Then he glanced up at the constable stationed nearby. "No one came through the front?" The constable shook his head, face pale. "No, sir." Craddock lifted the parcel carefully, as though it might contain something sharp. He carried it into the morning room, where a clear table stood. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a photograph. It was old, edges slightly curled. It showed a group of people standing outside a building that looked like the old courthouse at Market Basing. Men in coats, women in hats, and among them, younger, thinner unmistakably, were Colonel Havisham's father and Mr. Lester. But Miss Marple's attention went to the third figure standing between them. A man smiling faintly, his face turned toward the camera with confident ease. He held himself like someone who knew he belonged there. Mrs. Bantry gave a small gasp. "That is him." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Him?" "The guest," Mrs. Bantry whispered. "Or rather, he looks exactly like him." Dolly's hand flew to her mouth. Rose leaned forward, eyes wide, as if the photograph had dragged the past into the room by force. Miss Marple stared at the smiling man in the photograph. The resemblance was not vague. It was striking. The same shape of face, the same calm eyes, the same controlled confidence. Craddock's voice was low. "A relative." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. Or the same man if the photograph is not as old as it appears. But that seems unlikely. Craddock turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, were words. Market Basing Court. The Leicester matter. Remember who smiled. Rose's breathing quickened. Remember who smiled, she repeated, voice shaking. Miss Marple looked at her, then at Craddock. This is not merely evidence, it is accusation. Whoever left this wants someone to be recognized. Wants someone to feel the weight of memory. Craddock's eyes were sharp, and whoever left it entered the house without being seen. Miss Marple nodded. Or had help. Craddock straightened. We will search the house. Again. Every room. Every corridor. He moved quickly, barking quiet orders. Servants scattered. The constable hurried out. Footsteps echoed through the halls. Miss Marple remained in the morning room, staring at the photograph. Dolly hovered beside her, shaken. Rose stood rigid, as if her body had become a pillar holding her fear upright. Aunt Jane, Dolly whispered. This is terrifying. Miss Marple's voice was very calm. It is meant to be. Rose turned to Miss Marple, eyes desperate. My father wrote about a man who promised to help him, who smiled, who then turned away. Miss Marple, is that man in the photograph the betrayer? Miss Marple did not answer quickly. She answered honestly. He may be. Or he may be someone being used as a symbol. But the message is clear. Someone wants the village to look at a specific face and remember a specific feeling. Rose's voice cracked. Then the guest last night, the one who vanished. He came to show them his face. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the photograph again. Perhaps. Or someone came to show them a face that would terrify them, whether it was truly his or not. Dolly whispered, why would a face terrify them? Miss Marple looked at her niece with gentle sadness. Because a face can carry guilt. And guilt, when it has been buried too long, becomes fear. In the hallway, distant voices rose. Craddock called instructions. A door slammed. The house, usually dignified and calm, was now alive with searching. Miss Marple sat slowly. She felt the weight of the moment. The past had been turned into a weapon. A photograph, a message, a likeness. The missing guest was no longer only a man. He was a symbol being used to pry open old secrets. Human nature, she reflected, often preferred to believe that the past was finished, because the calendar had moved on. But the heart did not obey calendars. Old wrongs did not fade neatly. They changed shape. They waited. And when they returned, they often returned wearing a new face. Somewhere in the house, or perhaps outside it, someone was watching the search, listening to footsteps, measuring fear. And Miss Marple felt certain that the person who had placed that parcel had achieved exactly what they wanted. They had made the village remember. They had also made the village afraid. And fear, once awakened, did not easily go back to sleep. Chapter 5. Night settled over Gossington Hall with a deliberate quiet, as if the house itself had decided to speak less and listen more. The search that followed the parcel did not produce a hidden intruder or a trembling culprit in a cupboard. It produced only tired servants, opened doors, and the slow realization that fear could move through a familiar home without leaving fingerprints. Inspector Craddock stood in the hallway with his notebook, his face controlled, his eyes sharp. Lamps threw soft pools of light across polished floors. Shadows gathered in corners and along the staircase. Every corridor looked respectable, and every respectable corridor looked suddenly capable of concealment. Miss Marple remained in the morning room for a time, seated with her hands folded, watching Rose Leicester's rigid posture and Dolly's anxious glances. The photograph lay on the table like a cold object that refused to warm to human comfort. It had done its work. It had pulled old resentment into the present and dressed it in fresh urgency. Craddock returned at last. closing the door quietly behind him. "We found nothing," he said. "No one hidden. No secret entrance left ajar. No servant admitting to anything." Dolly's voice rose with frustration. "Then how did that parcel get into the hall?" Craddock's gaze flicked to her. "Because someone brought it in, either through a door we failed to see used, or from inside the house itself. Those are the only two possibilities." Miss Marple's tone was calm. "Or it was placed earlier and noticed later." Craddock nodded slowly. "We considered that. The servants insist it was not there at 8 o'clock. The hall was crossed repeatedly. It appeared after 8:30. Rose's voice was thin. So someone was inside." Craddock looked at her with a kind of professional gentleness. "It is possible. But it is also possible that someone outside timed it. A parcel can be slid through a gap. A window can be eased open a fraction. A door can be used in a way that leaves no sound if the person knows how." Miss Marple remembered the latch from the night the guest vanished, not fully settled. A house had many latches. A person who understood houses understood the quiet language of locks. Mrs. Bantry entered then, her face pale, her old folder held against her as if it were a shield. "Inspector," she said, "I keep thinking. That photograph, the writing on the back, it is not merely meant to frighten. It is meant to accuse someone in particular." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "The question is, who is the target of the accusation?" Miss Marple looked at the photograph again. "Remember who smiled? A message like that did not ask for a general memory. It asked for a specific one. It wanted a face connected to a feeling of betrayal." "Colonel Havisham," Dolly whispered, "will be furious." Craddock's mouth tightened. "Colonel Havisham will be questioned again." He moved toward the door. "Miss Marple, would you come with me?" Miss Marple rose. Dolly and Rose remained in the morning room under Mrs. Bantry's watchful care. In the corridor, the air felt cooler. The house seemed to hold its breath with them. Craddock led Miss Marple through a side passage to a small study where he had established a temporary base. Papers lay in neat piles. A lamp burned low. The local constable stood by the window, as if guarding the night. Craddock closed the door. "I want your opinion," he said. "Not on the emotions, but on the mechanics." Miss Marple sat, her posture neat. "You mean how he vanished?" "Exactly," Craddock replied. "A man arrives with luggage and a list of names. He behaves perfectly. Then he disappears. Later, a parcel appears in the hall with a photograph that resembles him strongly. It suggests he wanted to be recognized, yet he also wanted to be unreachable. That is a strange combination." "It is not so strange," Miss Marple said gently. "Some people want attention without consequence. They want the thrill of being feared, but they do not want to be caught." Craddock nodded slowly. "So you think he planned his disappearance from the start?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I think the disappearing was part of the visit, not an accident that happened during it. The visit was the stage. The vanishing was the act." Craddock opened a folder and slid a sheet of paper toward her. "This is a sketch of the ground. The yew hedge. The weak fence boards. The lanes. We found that cufflink near the hedge. We found no tracks beyond what we ourselves made, but the rain could have washed them. Still, he would have needed something. A coat. A way to avoid arriving at the station soaked. A way to leave without being memorable." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the sketch. He might have hidden clothing earlier. Craddock leaned forward. "Where?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Somewhere not searched, because it did not seem worth searching. An outhouse, a gardener's shed, a boot room, a coal store, or somewhere on the grounds, wrapped and tucked in foliage, marked in his mind." Craddock's gaze sharpened. "We searched the obvious outbuildings." Miss Marple nodded. "Then perhaps it was not on the grounds. Perhaps it was already with someone else." Craddock's pen stilled. "A helper." "A helper," Miss Marple agreed. "Someone who could hold a coat, a hat, perhaps an umbrella, and pass it quietly at the hedge. Someone who could meet him at a certain time. Someone who could also place that parcel later. Craddock's voice was flat. You believe a person in this house is involved. I believe it is possible, Miss Marple said. But I also believe the helper does not need to live here. A villager could do it. Or a servant with connections beyond this household. The constable shifted uneasily. Begging your pardon, miss, but the staff here are decent folk. Miss Marple's eyes were kind. Decent people help with improper things more often than you think. Not because they wish harm, but because they have loyalties. Or debts. Or fear. Craddock stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lawn where darkness lay like velvet. We found his luggage. It contained nothing that identified him. That suggests he expected to leave it behind. Yes, Miss Marple said. He brought only what would tell a story. A shaving kit, shirts, things that say, I am a respectable man. I belong here. He left behind what would keep people searching in the wrong direction. Craddock turned. In the wrong direction. Miss Marple nodded gently. People search for a man who ran away in a hurry, carrying all he owned. It is a familiar pattern. But he did not run away like that. He stepped away lightly. That is why the village feels unsettled. The familiar pattern does not fit. Craddock's voice lowered. I checked with the shop in London where the cufflink was bought. They remembered him. That memory is useful, but it tells me he planned the initial. The letter A can be anything. It is a prop. It is also a signal, Miss Marple said. A signal to someone who knows what A means. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Ambrose, Armitage, Andrew, or a surname, Miss Marple suggested. Or a place. Or an old nickname. People often forget how many names a man can carry. Craddock sat again, rubbing his forehead briefly. It was the first sign of fatigue Miss Marple had seen in him. If he planned this, then he is not merely hiding. He is directing events. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. And directing events requires confidence. It also requires knowledge of the village's old wounds. Craddock tapped the table. The Leicester case. The betrayal. The photograph. If the missing guest resembles the man in the photograph, then we have either a relative or an impersonation. Miss Marple's gaze held steady. Impersonation is more common than people like to admit, especially in places where memory is vague. A village remembers feelings, not exact faces. If a man can stir the feeling, the village will accept the face. Craddock's eyes sharpened as if something had clicked. Then he wanted them to react. He wanted them to think. It is him. Or it is connected to him. Yes, Miss Marple replied, because that reaction is the lever. Once guilt is stirred, people begin to defend themselves. And when people defend themselves, they reveal what they fear. A knock came at the study door. A maid's voice sounded, nervous but controlled. Inspector Colonel Havisham has arrived. He insists on speaking to you at once. Craddock's mouth tightened. Of course he does. He looked at Miss Marple. Would you sit in? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Colonel Havisham entered with the energy of a man trying to outrun his own unease. His coat was buttoned tightly. His moustache bristled. His eyes were bright. This is outrageous, he began at once. Outrageous. A parcel in the hall, accusations, villagers whispering about my family. I demand to know what you are suggesting. Craddock's voice remained calm. Colonel, I am suggesting nothing. I am asking questions. Havisham's gaze flicked to Miss Marple. And she is here to watch. Miss Marple smiled gently. I am here to listen, Colonel. Listening can be very useful, Havisham bristled. Fine. Listen. My father handled that Leicester affair properly. Legally. He did nothing underhand. If Leicester lost, he lost. That is life. Miss Marple's tone stayed mild. Did your father smile at him in court, Colonel? The question landed like a stone in water. Havisham's face changed slightly. Not dramatically, but enough. A tightening around the mouth. A brief blink. That is a ridiculous question, he said. Craddock watched him closely. It is not ridiculous if someone is using a photograph that says, "Remember who smiled." Havisham's jaw worked. My father was a confident man. He smiled, he shook hands, he did all the things respectable men do. It means nothing. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. To you, Colonel. But to a man losing everything, a smile can feel like cruelty. Havisham's eyes flashed. Lester was a stubborn fool. He ruined himself. Craddock leaned forward. Colonel, did you know the man who stood between your father and Lester in that photograph? Havisham hesitated. It was brief, but it was real. No, he said, or I do not recall. It was years ago. Miss Marple watched the hesitation. People often said they did not recall when they did recall, but wished not to. Craddock's voice remained steady. Colonel, I will ask you directly. Did anyone from your family make a private agreement with Lester that was later broken? Havisham's face reddened. No. Miss Marple spoke softly. Colonel, anger is sometimes a sign that a question has touched something tender. Havisham slammed a hand on the chair back, not hard enough to damage it, but hard enough to express frustration. You can all go to the devil. I have said what I have to say. He turned and strode out. Craddock exhaled slowly after the door closed. He is hiding something. Miss Marple's eyes remained gentle. He is hiding a feeling. The question is whether the feeling is guilt, or fear, or simply pride. Craddock looked at the sketch again, then toward the hallway beyond. Either way, someone is orchestrating this, and if they are orchestrating it, they will need another move. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. A disappearance by design does not end with a single vanishing. It ends when the intended person breaks. Craddock's gaze sharpened. Then our task is to determine who is meant to break. Miss Marple thought of Rose Lester's letter. Be present. Of the photograph message. Remember who smiled. Of Colonel Havisham's flushed denial. And she felt, very calmly, that the next move would not be a loud one. It would be quiet, like the first. It would be another carefully placed object, another small pressure point, another invitation to fear. Human nature did not always need violence to collapse. Sometimes it collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. Later that night, Gossington Hall tried to return to routine, but routine would not settle properly. The servants moved as if every corridor might contain an unseen watcher. Mrs. Bantry spoke softly, smiling when she remembered, and then forgetting to smile when she did not. Dolly hovered near Rose with a restless kindness, offering tea, offering biscuits, offering anything that might make fear seem smaller. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, because knitting gave the hands something calm to do, while the mind watched the room. The firelight reflected softly in the windows. Outside, the garden was dark and still. Inspector Craddock remained in the house, taking a room for the night. He had placed an officer near the front and another near the side lane. He did not announce it, but Miss Marple could feel the difference. A house with police in it did not breathe in the same way. It held itself rigid. Near midnight, Miss Marple rose and walked quietly to the hallway, as if checking for a draft. She had learned that in tense houses, small movements could reveal much. If a servant startled, it meant they were listening. If a door was ajar, it meant someone expected to move. The hall was empty. Lamps burned low. The coat stand stood in its corner, respectable and innocent. The rug lay flat. Nothing waited on the polished floor. And yet Miss Marple felt, with that quiet certainty she trusted, that something had changed. She leaned slightly toward the window near the staircase. The latch was secure, but the curtain had shifted, as if someone had brushed it and not set it back exactly. A small thing, a small sign. The house was being used. She returned to the drawing room. Rose had fallen into a light, uneasy sleep in a chair. her head tilted slightly. Dolly sat beside her, eyes wide and sleepless. Mrs. Bantry had gone upstairs. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Miss Marple resumed her seat and her knitting, but her attention remained on the corners of the room, on the doorway, on the angle of the carpet. At 12:30, footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. They were soft, controlled, not the heavy steps of a man who did not care. The door opened, and Inspector Craddock entered, fully dressed, his expression focused. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "something is happening." Dolly sat upright at once. "What?" Craddock gestured toward the hallway. The officer by the side lane saw a light moving near the old gardener's shed. He thought at first it was a servant, but it moved too carefully. "We are going to look. I want you to stay here, but I also know you will not." Miss Marple rose. "No," she said simply. "I will come. But we must not wake Miss Lester unless necessary." Dolly looked at Rose, and then at her aunt. "I will stay." Craddock nodded once, approving. He led Miss Marple through the corridor and down a back stair that servants used. The house was quiet around them, the quiet of polished surfaces and sleeping rooms. Outside, cold air touched Miss Marple's face. The garden smelled of damp earth and winter leaves. A faint mist hung low. The moon was thin, giving just enough light to outline hedges and trees. Two officers stood near the path, their shapes dark against the lawn. One pointed toward the far side where the gardener's shed sat, a small building half hidden by shrubs. Craddock moved forward, careful, his torch angled low. Miss Marple followed, her steps slow but steady. She did not feel fear in the dramatic sense. She felt alertness, the kind that made every sound meaningful. Near the shed, the inspector raised his hand, signaling stillness. The officers paused. Miss Marple heard it then, a faint sound, like cloth brushing wood. Someone was there. Craddock moved to the shed door and pulled it open quickly. Inside, a man stood frozen with surprise, his torch shining downward. For a heartbeat, the light caught his face. He was not the missing guest. He was younger, rougher, with a nervous mouth and eyes that darted like a trapped animal. One of the officers seized him. The man gave a sharp breath and began to protest. "I was not stealing," he said quickly. "I swear it. I was only looking." Craddock's voice was quiet and dangerous. "Who are you?" The man swallowed. "My name is Peter Lacey. I work for the estate sometimes." Odd jobs. Craddock's torch moved over the shed interior. Tools hung on hooks, bags of seed, a coil of rope, and on a bench, carefully folded as if prepared, a dark overcoat, a hat, and a scarf. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the coat. It looked like a gentleman's coat, well made, not the sort Peter Lacey would wear. Craddock's jaw tightened. He lifted the coat and checked the pockets. Inside he found a small leather case. He opened it and withdrew a pair of gloves and a second cufflink, plain silver, with the same engraved letter A. Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a pattern confirming itself. A coat waiting. A disguise waiting. A planned exit. Craddock held the cufflink up to the light. "Where did you get this?" Peter Lacey's face drained of color. "I did not get it. It was already here." Craddock's voice sharpened. "Already here since when, I do not know." Peter stammered. "I do not come in this shed often. I only came tonight because someone told me there would be something for me." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Someone?" Peter's gaze flicked toward the house. "I cannot say." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Peter, you can say. Fear is heavy to carry alone." "Who told you?" Peter's throat worked. "A note. It was under my door. It said, 'Come to the shed tonight, and you will find what you are owed.'" Craddock's torch flashed to his face. What you are owed for what? Peter's lips trembled. For helping. For doing a small job. Just a small one. Miss Marple's tone stayed calm. What small job? Peter looked as if he might faint. I opened the side gate the night of the supper. Only for a moment. I loosened the board by the fence like I was told. I did not think it would harm anyone. I thought it was just someone wanting to leave quietly. Craddock's voice was tight. Who told you? Peter shook his head, eyes wild. I do not know. I never saw their face. They met me near the hedge in the dark. They had a hat pulled low. They spoke softly, like a gentleman. They said it was none of my business. They said I would be paid. Miss Marple looked at the coat again. The plan was becoming visible, like ink developing on paper. A helper. A hidden outfit. A prearranged escape route. Craddock's voice lowered. And were you paid? Peter's shoulders sagged. Not yet. Craddock held up the leather case. This is what you came for. Peter nodded weakly. Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. Peter, did the person who met you have a mark on their wrist? Peter blinked, confused by the detail. I did not see. It was dark. Craddock turned to the officers. Take him inside. Keep him warm. We will question him properly. As Peter was led away, Miss Marple and Craddock remained by the shed. The garden was silent again. The house loomed beyond, lit softly, looking peaceful as if it had no interest in secrets. Craddock stared at the coat and cufflink. So the disappearance was planned. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. Planned with care. Planned with a helper who believed it was harmless. Craddock's eyes narrowed, and the parcel in the hall. That could also have been placed by someone using the same route. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, or by someone with access inside. But now we know there is an outside route. That matters. Craddock exhaled, his breath faint in the cold air. Whoever is doing this is close enough to understand the grounds, close enough to recruit a worker, close enough to know the village's old wounds. They are not a stranger passing through. Miss Marple looked toward the hedge, dark and wet. No, she said softly. They belong to this story. That is why they can control it. Craddock's voice was low. And the missing guest. Was he the same person who wrote the letters? Miss Marple did not rush. Possibly. Or he may be one piece of a larger plan. A face used to awaken memory. A name used to hide identity. Sometimes people work alone, Inspector. Sometimes they persuade others. And sometimes they become a symbol that another person uses. Craddock's gaze stayed on the coat. The second cufflink suggests the man intended to remove both. To drop one near the hedge and keep one for later. Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. Or to leave breadcrumbs. A trail that looks accidental. A trail that draws attention exactly where he wants it. Craddock's jaw tightened. Then he is still directing us. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Yes, but directing requires control, and control can slip when a plan grows complicated. The more moving parts, the more chances for a mistake. Craddock looked at her. What mistake are we waiting for? Miss Marple thought of the photograph, of Rose, of Colonel Havisham's anger, of the old letter in Mrs. Bantry's folder. She thought of Peter Lacey's frightened compliance. She thought of a person clever enough to use fear without showing their face. The mistake of believing people are only tools, she said softly. Tools can break. Or they can speak. And when they speak, the truth often comes out in fragments. But fragments are enough for someone who knows how to fit them together. Craddock's eyes held hers. And do you know how? Miss Marple gave a small, gentle smile. I have had a great deal of practice, Inspector. Villages are full of broken tools and sharp fragments. One simply has to be patient. They walked back toward the house through the cold, damp garden. The lamps in the windows glowed like quiet eyes. Inside, someone was still awake, still frightened, still waiting for the next move. And Miss Marple felt, very calmly, that the next move would come sooner now. Because once a plan was exposed, the person behind it either retreated or rushed forward. And people who used the past as a weapon rarely liked retreat. The vanishing guest had disappeared by design. But design had begun to unravel. Now the question was not only where the missing guest was. The question was who was writing the script, and how far they were willing to go to make the village speak the truth it had buried. The truth was waiting in the one place the village never searched properly, the place it passed every day without seeing. Mr. Hollis led Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple, and Rose Lester to a disused gardener's cottage beyond the yew hedge, hidden by winter shrubs and old stonework. Inside, the vanishing guest sat calmly by a small fire, coat folded, hat set neatly beside him, as if he had only stepped out for quiet air. He did not resist, he only smiled, and the smile was the same one in the photograph. His real name was Armitage, once a smooth fixer, who had guided men into decisions that ruined their neighbors while he stayed clean. The Lester defeat had been legal, but the cruelty around it had been arranged, and Armitage had enjoyed the power. He returned now to force a confession, to make the village admit the contempt it had hidden. He used letters, props, and fear, believing he could control every reaction. But he misjudged one thing. He assumed guilt would keep people silent forever. Miss Marple spoke gently, and the right person finally admitted the private betrayal that had broken the Lesters. Rose heard the truth she deserved. Armitage was taken away. The village exhaled. Quietly, St. Mary Mead learned that forgotten wrongs do not vanish. They wait until someone dares to name them.